The massive chamber of the Galactic Council stretched upward like a cathedral built for giants. Thousands of seats circled the central platform in ascending rings, each one filled with delegates from across the galaxy. The air hummed with translation devices converting hundreds of languages into coherent speech. Holographic displays floated above each delegation, showing voting records and proposals in real time. Ambassador Daniel Green sat in the human section, his hands folded on the smooth metal table before him. He had occupied this seat for 5 years now, and in that time he had watched the same pattern repeat itself over and over again. Human proposals were ignored. Human concerns were dismissed. Human achievements were credited to other species or explained away as lucky accidents. Beside him sat Commander Lisa Hayes, her military uniform crisp and decorated with medals from 3 different campaigns. She had served the Galactic Council faithfully, leading human forces to protect vulnerable species and maintain peace in contested regions. Her efforts had saved countless lives, yet when promotions were discussed, she was always passed over in favor of less experienced officers from other species. On Daniel's other side, Dr. Peter Brooks reviewed data on his tablet. The scientist had spent decades developing technologies that the Council now used freely. His medical advances had cured diseases across a dozen worlds. His engineering breakthroughs had made space travel safer for everyone. But when the Council announced their annual awards for scientific achievement, Peter's name was never mentioned. The credit always went to the alien researchers who had merely implemented his designs. The current speaker was Delegate Vexenar, a tall centauri with silver skin and eyes like polished obsidian. He stood at the central podium, his voice carrying across the chamber with practiced authority. He was discussing economic policy, specifically a new proposal to adjust export taxes for member species. Daniel had seen the proposal 3 days ago. The numbers were staggering. Under this new system, humanity would pay 70% tax on all exports to Council space. Meanwhile, species like the Vrexian would pay only 20%, and the Centauri themselves would pay a mere 15%. The justification was printed in neat bureaucratic language in the proposal document. Humanity was classified as economically immature. They needed guidance and oversight. The high taxes were for their own good, to teach them proper trading practices and prevent them from making costly mistakes. Daniel had drafted a response, a carefully worded argument explaining why this policy was both unfair and economically unsound. He had data showing that human trade had boosted the Council economy by 30% over the last decade. He had testimonials from species who relied on human goods and services. He had everything needed to make a compelling case. He pressed the button to request speaking time. A small light appeared above the human delegation section, indicating that they wished to address the Council. Daniel waited. The light continued to blink, ignored by the chairman who controlled the speaking queue. Vexenar continued his presentation, now moving on to other economic matters. He discussed mineral rights and shipping lanes, trade agreements, and tariff schedules. He never once mentioned the human proposal that Daniel had submitted 2 weeks ago, the one requesting equal representation on the Economic Committee. Lisa leaned close to Daniel and whispered. Her voice was tight with controlled anger. She had just received a message from the military command. Human forces were being reassigned from strategic positions to patrol duty in empty sectors. Meanwhile, their former posts were being given to Vrexian commanders who had complained that the current assignments were beneath them. Peter showed Daniel his tablet. A message had arrived from the Science Council. They were rejecting his latest research proposal, the one about faster-than-light communication breakthroughs. The reason given was insufficient theoretical foundation, which was absurd considering Peter had already built a working prototype. The real reason, Peter suspected, was that they didn't want humans to be seen as leaders in such an important field. The vote on the tax proposal began. Holographic displays showed the tally in real time. Green lights for approval, red lights for rejection. The green lights multiplied rapidly. Species after species voted to approve the 70% tax on human exports. Daniel watched the numbers climb, feeling something cold settle in his chest. He pressed his speaking request button again. The light above the human section continued to blink, still ignored. Daniel stood up, hoping that the physical motion would draw attention. Several nearby delegates glanced his way, then quickly looked back to their own displays. The vote concluded. The measure passed with overwhelming support. Only a handful of smaller species had voted against it, and Daniel suspected that was more out of fear that they might be targeted next, rather than any real solidarity with humanity. Chairman Torvis, a massive creature with 6 arms and crystalline skin, announced the result in his booming voice. The measure was now law. All member species would be expected to comply immediately. He began to move on to the next item on the agenda. Daniel's speaking light was still blinking. 5 minutes now, completely ignored. He felt Lisa's hand on his arm, felt Peter's eyes on him. They were both watching, waiting to see what he would do. He reached up and touched his translation device, the small unit that fit behind his ear, and allowed him to understand and be understood by every species in the chamber. His fingers found the release catch. He pressed it. The device came free in his hand. The galaxy seemed to slow down around him. Daniel looked at the small piece of technology in his palm, this thing that had connected him to the galactic community for so many years. He placed it carefully on the table in front of him. The gesture was precise and deliberate. Lisa understood immediately. Her own hand went to her translation device. She removed it and placed it beside Daniel's. Peter hesitated for only a moment before doing the same. 3 translation devices sat in a neat row on the human delegation table. Daniel turned and walked toward the exit. His footsteps echoed in the sudden quiet that had fallen over the nearby sections. Delegates were beginning to notice, beginning to understand that something unprecedented was happening. Lisa followed Daniel, her military bearing perfect, her face expressionless. Peter gathered his tablet and fell in step behind her. Other members of the human delegation, staff and advisors and technical specialists, all began to stand. Translation devices appeared on tables throughout the human section, like flowers blooming in sequence. The entire human delegation was walking out. Chairman Torvis finally noticed. His voice boomed across the chamber, demanding to know what was happening. But Daniel's translation device was on the table behind him, and he could no longer understand the chairman's words. He could only hear the alien syllables, harsh and incomprehensible. He kept walking. Behind him, the murmur of thousands of voices rose like a wave. Confusion, anger, disbelief. The humans were leaving. The humans who had never caused trouble, who had always been reliable and cooperative and eager to help, were walking away from the Galactic Council. Daniel reached the massive doors that led out of the chamber. They opened before him with a whisper of hydraulics. Beyond them lay the docking corridor where the human ships waited. He stepped through the threshold and did not look back. President Helen Carter stood before the cameras in the White House press room, her expression calm but her eyes carrying the weight of a decision that would reshape humanity's place in the galaxy. Behind her, the flags of Earth's United Nations hung in silent witness. She had spent 3 days in continuous meetings with world leaders, military commanders, and economic advisors. The decision had been unanimous. She began to speak, her voice steady and clear. Humanity was formally withdrawing from the Galactic Council, effective immediately. All trade agreements were terminated. All military support agreements were void. All human personnel serving in council space were ordered to return home. The decision was final and not open to negotiation. The broadcast reached every human settlement across dozens of star systems. On Mars, colonists gathered in common areas to watch. On the mining stations of the asteroid belt, workers stopped their shifts to listen. On distant frontier worlds where humans had built new homes among the stars, families sat together and heard the news that would change everything. Within hours, human ships began moving. Trade convoys that had been en route to alien markets turned around mid-journey, their cargo holds full of goods that would now never be delivered. Medical ships serving in council space started packing up equipment and saying goodbye to patients they had been treating for months. Engineering teams working on alien infrastructure projects shut down their operations and headed for the nearest human transport. The withdrawal was organized and efficient, a testament to human military precision and planning. Every ship knew where to go and when. Every person had clear instructions. There was no panic, no chaos. Only a systematic disengagement from 3 decades of galactic cooperation. Captain Jake Morrison stood on the bridge of the Earth frigate Defiant, watching the tactical display as his ship prepared to leave the Miran system. He was a career officer, 20 years in space, and he had spent the last 3 of those years protecting this system from pirates and raiders. The Miran were a peaceful species, evolved from aquatic mammals on their ocean world. They had no military to speak of, no weapons capable of defending against even the smallest hostile force. His communications officer, Lieutenant Amy Chen, looked up from her station with concern on her face. The Miran government had been sending messages for the past hour, increasingly desperate pleas for the humans to reconsider. They had treaties, they said. They had agreements. The humans had promised to protect them. Jake knew those promises had been made in good faith, but circumstances had changed. The Galactic Council had made its position clear, and humanity had made its response. Orders were orders, and the chain of command led all the way up to President Carter herself. Amy argued that they should stay anyway, that leaving the Miran defenseless was wrong. Jake understood her feelings because he shared them, but he also understood duty in the bigger picture. If they ignored orders, they would be court-martialed. More importantly, if humanity wanted to make a statement about being taken seriously, they had to follow through completely. The Defiant's sister ships, the Valiant and the Resolute, had already departed. Jake's ship was the last human military presence in the system. As the final preparations for departure were completed, Jake authorized one last message to the Miran government. He told them he was sorry, that this wasn't personal, and that they should petition the Galactic Council for new protectors. The response came back immediately. The Miran had already contacted the Council. They had been told that protection would be arranged, but it would take time. Weeks, maybe months. In the meantime, they were on their own. Amy turned away from her console, unable to watch as the Defiant powered up its faster-than-light drive. The ship began to vibrate with the familiar sensation of hyperspace preparation. On the main view screen, the blue-green world of Miran Prime hung against the black of space, peaceful and vulnerable. Jake gave the order and the Defiant jumped. In an instant, the Miran system vanished behind them, replaced by the swirling colors of hyperspace. They were going home, and they were leaving an entire civilization exposed to danger. The pattern repeated across Council space. Human doctors departed from medical stations on the frontier worlds where disease was common, and healthcare was primitive. The aliens who remained watched them go with growing anxiety. Who would handle the next outbreak? Who would train the local medical staff? The Council had promised replacements, but none had arrived yet. Human engineers left construction projects half-finished. Space stations that were being expanded, planetary defense grids that were being upgraded, communication networks that were being installed. All of it stopped when the human workers packed up and left. The other species complained to the Council, demanding that the work be completed, but the Council had no immediate solutions. Trade was perhaps the hardest hit sector. Human merchants had established routes throughout Council space, carrying goods to markets that had grown dependent on them. Earth manufacturers were known for their quality and reliability. Human food products were popular on dozens of worlds. Human entertainment and art had found audiences everywhere. When the human ships stopped coming, the markets felt it immediately. Prices began to rise as supplies dwindled. Species that had grown accustomed to certain products found them suddenly unavailable. Some tried to source alternatives from other species, but discovered that either the quality was lower or the price was higher, or both. The economic ripples spread outward like waves from a stone thrown into still water. Businesses that relied on human suppliers struggled. Workers who had jobs connected to human trade found themselves facing uncertainty. The Council's economists scrambled to model the impact and found the numbers alarming. Back on Earth, Administrator Kyle Bennett watched reports coming in from his contacts still in Council space. He had served as a diplomatic attaché for 7 years before being recalled during the withdrawal. He knew the systems and the people, and he knew exactly what was happening now that humanity had removed itself from the equation. The reports painted a clear picture. The Galactic Council had built its economy and security on a foundation that included significant human contributions, but they had never acknowledged the importance of those contributions. They had taken human reliability for granted, assumed human cooperation was unlimited, and never considered what would happen if humanity simply stopped participating. Kyle forwarded the reports to President Carter with his own analysis attached. The council was in trouble, but they didn't fully realize it yet. They were still operating under the assumption that humans would come back once they calmed down, that this was a temporary tantrum that would blow over. Kyle knew better. He had been in the chamber when Daniel Green walked out. He had seen the look on Daniel's face, the quiet determination of a man who had finally had enough. This wasn't a negotiating tactic or a bluff. Humanity had genuinely walked away, and they weren't coming back unless something fundamental changed. President Carter read the report in her private office, late at night when the White House was quiet. She had made the hardest decision of her presidency, and she knew that people would suffer because of it. Good people, innocent people, species like the Moran who had done nothing wrong except trust in human protection. But she also knew that respect wasn't freely given. It had to be earned, and sometimes it had to be demanded. Humanity had tried earning it through service and contribution. That hadn't worked. Now they were trying a different approach. Sometimes, she thought, you had to show people what they would lose before they understood what they had. The emergency session of the Galactic Council convened 3 weeks after the human withdrawal, and the atmosphere in the chamber was nothing like the usual calm proceedings. Delegates spoke over each other, voices rising in anger and fear. The holographic displays showed maps marked with red zones indicating crisis points, and there were far too many of them. Chairman Torvis called for order repeatedly, his 6 arms gesturing for silence. But it took several minutes before the chamber settled enough for the session to begin properly. He announced that they would hear a comprehensive report on the current situation, and he called upon Counselor Vexnar of the Centauri to present the findings. Vexnar approached the central podium with none of his usual confidence. The silver-skinned delegate looked tired, and his voice lacked the authority it normally carried. He activated the main display, and a galaxy map appeared, dotted with indicators showing problem areas across council space. He began with the Moran system. 2 weeks after the human departure, pirates had raided the orbital stations, stealing supplies and destroying infrastructure. The Moran had no way to defend themselves, and their calls for help had gone unanswered, because no council species had ships in that region. 4 days later, a second raid had occurred, this time hitting the planet itself. Casualty reports were still coming in, but the numbers were in the thousands. The chamber fell silent as the reality of the situation sank in. The Moran had been protected for 15 years by human forces, and everyone had simply assumed that protection would continue forever. Now the Moran were suffering, and the council had failed to provide the security they had promised. Vexnar continued with more reports. Trade routes that humans had patrolled were now hunting grounds for raiders and pirates. Merchant ships from various species were being attacked regularly. Insurance rates for shipping had tripled in just 2 weeks, and some routes were being abandoned entirely because they were too dangerous. Medical stations on frontier worlds were reporting crisis situations. A plague had broken out on Rixian Prime, a disease that human doctors had dealt with successfully 3 times before. But there were no human doctors anymore, and the local medical staff didn't have the knowledge or resources to contain it. The death toll was climbing daily, already past 5,000 and accelerating. Engineering projects across council space had ground to a halt. The humans had been involved in dozens of major infrastructure initiatives, and their sudden absence had left gaps that couldn't be easily filled. Some projects could potentially be completed by other species, but it would take time to bring in new teams and get them up to speed. Other projects required specific human expertise that wasn't available anywhere else. Vexnar pulled up economic data that made several delegates gasp. Trade volume had dropped by 30%. Entire market sectors were disrupted. Supply chains that had functioned smoothly for years were breaking down. Unemployment was rising on multiple worlds as businesses that depended on human trade collapsed. Then came the most alarming news. The Krathun Empire was mobilizing. Long-range sensors had detected major fleet movements along the frontier. The Krathun were an aggressive warrior species that had always coveted council territory, but had never dared to attack because the cost would be too high. Now, with human forces gone, they apparently saw an opportunity. Delegate Thren of the Vrexian Empire stood to speak. He was a decorated military commander, and his people prided themselves on their martial prowess. He insisted that the council was overreacting. Humanity had never been that important to Galactic C. Security. Yes, humans had patrolled some routes and protected some systems, but other species could handle those responsibilities. The Vrexian fleet alone could deal with the Krathun threat if necessary. Chairman Torvis asked Thren directly if the Vrexian Empire was willing to commit ships to protect the Miran system. Thren hesitated. The Miran system was far from Vrexian space, he said. It would be difficult to maintain a presence there. Perhaps another species closer to that region should take responsibility. Torvis turned to other delegates. Who would protect the vulnerable systems? Who would patrol the dangerous trade routes? Who would staff the frontier medical stations? One by one, delegates found reasons why their species couldn't take on these responsibilities. It was too far from their territory. They didn't have enough ships. Their people weren't trained for that kind of work. The cost would be too high. The excuses filled the chamber like smoke, and slowly the truth became clear. The humans had been doing jobs that nobody else wanted to do. They had taken on the difficult, dangerous, expensive work of maintaining galactic security and order, and they had done it willingly. Now that they were gone, no one wanted to fill the void they had left behind. A junior delegate from a small species called the Paxian stood to speak. His voice was quiet, but it carried in the sudden silence. He pointed out that humans had never asked for much in return for their service. They had accepted low status in the council hierarchy. They had paid unfair taxes. They had been dismissed and disrespected at every turn. And still they had continued to serve faithfully until the breaking point. The junior delegate suggested that perhaps the council should reconsider its treatment of humanity. Perhaps an apology was in order, or at least an acknowledgement that humans had contributed far more than anyone had appreciated. His words hung in the air like an accusation. Delegate Thren responded angrily. The Vrexian commander declared that the council should not beg humans to return. It would make them look weak. Humanity had abandoned its commitments and broken its treaties. They were the ones in the wrong, not the council. If humans wanted to be children and storm off when they didn't get their way, then let them stay gone. Other delegates murmured agreement, though their voices lacked conviction. It was easier to blame humanity than to admit their own mistakes. It was more comfortable to pretend that the crisis was temporary and would resolve itself without difficult changes. Chairman Torvis closed the session without any clear decisions. The council would continue to monitor the situation, he announced. They would work to find solutions to the current challenges. Member species were encouraged to step forward with offers of assistance for the affected regions. As delegates filed out of the chamber, small groups formed in the corridors outside, discussing the session in hushed voices. Some maintained that the council had done nothing wrong, and that humans were being unreasonable. Others quietly admitted that perhaps humanity had been treated poorly, though few were willing to say so publicly. On Earth, Administrator Kyle Bennett reviewed a recording of the session that his contacts had provided. He watched Vexnar's presentation, saw the maps showing crisis zones, heard the excuses from delegates who refused to step up. He prepared a new report for President Carter. The Galactic Council was in denial, Kyle wrote. They had been confronted with clear evidence of how much they depended on humanity, but most of them were refusing to accept it. They were still hoping that humans would simply come back on their own, that the crisis would force humanity to return without the council having to change anything. Kyle noted that the Krathun mobilization was particularly concerning. The warrior empire had been quiet for decades, kept in check by the knowledge that human tactical doctrine was unpredictable and effective. Human commanders had a reputation for creative thinking and a willingness to accept risk that made them dangerous opponents. Without that deterrent, the Krathun were testing the waters. President Carter read the report with a heavy heart. People were dying because of her decision. Systems were suffering. The galaxy was becoming more dangerous. Part of her wanted to send the ships back, to resume protecting those who needed protection regardless of politics. But she knew that would accomplish nothing in the long term. The council would see it as proof that humans could be pushed around, that their protests could be safely ignored. The same pattern would repeat itself, the same disrespect and dismissal, until eventually another breaking point was reached. Sometimes the right choice was also the hard choice. Sometimes helping people meant refusing to enable those who took advantage of that help. President Carter approved orders to maintain the withdrawal and began preparing for what she knew would come next. 2 months had passed since humanity walked away from the Galactic Council, and the situation in Council space had deteriorated from crisis to catastrophe. The Krathun Empire had moved beyond mobilization to open aggression, seizing 3 border systems in lightning strikes that overwhelmed the minimal defenses in place. Pirate attacks had increased by 400%, as raiders realized that nobody was actively hunting them anymore. The plague on Rixian Prime had killed over 20,000 people before finally burning itself out, leaving entire cities devastated and the survivors bitter about the help that never came. Ambassador Sophie Lang sat in her office at the United Nations building in New York, reviewing the latest intelligence reports from Council space. She had taken over Daniel Green's position after the withdrawal, though her job now was very different from what his had been. Instead of representing humanity to the Council, she monitored the Council's activities and advised the President on galactic affairs. It was a quieter role but no less important. Her secure terminal chimed with an incoming message marked with the highest priority codes. Sophie opened it and felt her eyebrows rise in surprise. It was an official communication from the Galactic Council, transmitted through diplomatic channels that hadn't been used in 2 months. The message was brief and formal, addressed to the government of Earth and all human colonies. The Council demanded that humanity honor its commitments immediately. All human personnel were required to return to their previous positions without delay. All military forces were to resume their protective duties at once. All trade agreements were to be reinstated under the original terms. The message stated that humanity's abandonment of Council space was irresponsible and childish, a breach of trust that had caused unnecessary suffering. Sophie read the message 3 times, feeling anger build with each reading. There was no apology, no acknowledgement of how humans had been treated, no offer to discuss better terms or address human concerns, just demands, phrased as though humanity had been bad children who needed to be scolded into obedience. She began composing a response, keeping her language formal and diplomatic while making the position crystal clear. Humanity owed the Council nothing. Every commitment had been honored faithfully until the moment of withdrawal, and that withdrawal had been executed according to proper procedures. If the Council was now suffering from the absence of human contributions, perhaps they should have considered the value of those contributions earlier. Sophie attached a detailed document to her response. It was an itemized list of every human contribution to the Galactic Council over 30 years. Every trade route patrolled, every system defended, every medical station staffed, every engineering project completed. Beside each item was a note about how that contribution had been received, dismissed, ignored, credited to others, or taken for granted. The document ran to 47 pages. Sophie sent it along with her brief response that humanity would not be returning under the current circumstances. She marked the message as final and transmitted it through the same diplomatic channels. The Council's second message arrived within 3 hours, which told Sophie everything she needed to know about how desperate they were becoming. This message came directly from Chairman Torvis himself, and the tone was completely different. It was a request, almost a plea, for humanity to negotiate a return to Council space. The chairman acknowledged that there had been misunderstandings in the past. He suggested that both sides had perhaps been too hasty. He proposed immediate talks to discuss how humanity might resume its valued role in the galactic community. The message carefully avoided anything that might be construed as an actual apology, but the change in attitude was obvious. Sophie forwarded both messages to President Carter along with her recommendation. The Council was finally ready to talk seriously, but they were still trying to avoid admitting fault. If humanity moved too quickly, the lesson would be lost. If they delayed too long, more innocent people would suffer. The balance point needed to be found carefully. President Carter convened her National Security Council in the Situation Room deep beneath the White House. Around the table sat the key decision-makers who would determine humanity's path forward. Secretary of State Linda Walsh, Defense Secretary Gary Ross, National Security Advisor Patricia Cole, and several military commanders, including General Marcus Flynn. General Flynn argued passionately that humanity needed to help immediately. The Krathun were conquering systems and people were dying. Every day of delay meant more casualties, more destruction. Human forces could stop the Krathun advance if they were deployed soon, But if they waited too long, the strategic situation would become much more difficult. Secretary Walsh countered that rushing back would teach the Council nothing. They needed to understand that respect had to be earned through recognition, not extorted through desperation. If humanity returned now, the Council would conclude that sufficient pressure would always bring humans back in line, and the cycle of disrespect would continue. The debate went back and forth for hours. Patricia Cole suggested a middle path, agreed to negotiate but set clear conditions before any human forces returned. Make the Council commit to concrete changes before offering help. General Flynn worried that the conditions might take too long to negotiate while the Krathen continued their conquest. President Carter listened to all the arguments before making her decision. Humanity would agree to negotiations, but those negotiations would take place on human territory, not in Council space. The Council would have to come to Earth if they wanted to talk. Furthermore, there would be no military deployment until a formal treaty was signed, guaranteeing equal status for humanity in all Council affairs. The President knew this would be seen as a hard line, but she believed it was necessary. The Council needed to demonstrate real commitment to change, not just make empty promises under pressure. If they were serious about treating humanity as equals, they would accept these terms. Sophie transmitted the response to the Council. The negotiations would be held at the human space station Unity, a neutral location in the outer reaches of the Sol system. The Council could send a delegation at their convenience, but humanity would not discuss any assistance until political equality was addressed first. Military matters would be discussed only after the political framework was established. The message concluded with a statement that Sophie had drafted herself, and the President had approved. It noted that humanity had always been willing to help those in need, but help freely given was different from help extracted under false pretenses. The Council had the opportunity to build a real partnership with humanity, one based on mutual respect and equality. Whether they chose to take that opportunity was up to them. Back in Council space, Chairman Torvis received the human response in his private chambers. He read it carefully, then read it again. The humans were not going to make this easy. They wanted real concessions, formal agreements, guaranteed equality. They wanted the Council to come to them as supplicants rather than summoning them back as subordinates. Torvis knew that many Council members would resist these terms. Delegate Thren and others like him would see it as humiliation, as weakness to beg humanity for help. But Torvis also knew the strategic reality. The Krathen were not going to stop with 3 systems. Pirate attacks were destroying trade. The Council's authority was eroding as member species lost faith in its ability to provide security. He made the decision that his position demanded. The Council would send a delegation to negotiate with humanity. Torvis would lead it himself, bringing representatives from the major species. They would go to this space station Unity, and they would negotiate in good faith. The alternative was watching the Council collapse under the weight of its own arrogance. Word spread quickly through Council space that formal negotiations had been arranged. Some species expressed relief that humanity might return soon. Others grumbled about the terms and the presumption of humans demanding equality. The Moran sent a message of desperate hope, praying that the negotiations would succeed before another pirate raid destroyed what little they had left. On Earth, Sophie Lang prepared briefing documents for the negotiating team that would meet with the Council delegation. She included historical precedents, legal frameworks, and detailed proposals for how the new relationship should be structured. Everything was designed to ensure that humanity would never again be in the position of being taken for granted. President Carter reviewed the documents late into the night, knowing that the coming negotiations would determine not just humanity's place in the galaxy, but potentially the fate of countless beings who depended on the stability that only a properly functioning Council could provide. She had walked humanity away from the table. Now she needed to ensure that when they returned, it would be as true equals. The space station Unity hung in the darkness beyond Neptune's orbit, a gleaming structure of metal and composite materials that represented humanity's achievement in deep space construction. It had been built specifically for occasions like this, a neutral meeting ground far from Earth but still within the protective embrace of the Sol system. The station's conference facilities were designed to accommodate dozens of different species, with adjustable gravity, atmospheric controls, and translation systems that could handle any language. Ambassador Daniel Green stood at the observation window of his quarters, watching the council delegation's ships approach. He had retired after walking out of the council chamber 2 months ago, content to spend his remaining years teaching at the Diplomatic Academy. But President Carter had personally asked him to lead the human negotiating team, and he couldn't refuse. This was his chance to finish what he had started, to ensure that his dramatic exit had not been in vain. The council delegation arrived in a convoy of ships representing the major species of the galactic community. Chairman Torvis came aboard first, his massive crystalline form moving carefully through corridors designed for smaller beings. Behind him came Delegate Thren of the Vrexian Empire, still wearing his military decorations, his expression carefully neutral. Other delegates followed, representing the Centauri, the Paxian, the Moran, and a dozen other species. The formal greeting ceremony was brief and professional. Daniel welcomed the delegates to Unity Station and directed them to their assigned quarters. The actual negotiations would begin the following day, giving everyone time to adjust to the station's environment and prepare their positions. That evening, Daniel met with his negotiating team in a secure conference room. Sophie Lang was there, along with Linda Walsh and several military advisors. They reviewed their strategy one final time. The council would likely try to rush straight to military discussions, wanting human ships deployed against the Krathun immediately. The human team needed to stand firm and address political equality first. The negotiations began the next morning in Unity's main conference hall. The room was arranged with 2 long tables facing each other, the council delegation on one side and the human team on the other. Neutral observers from several minor species sat along the walls, present to witness and verify whatever agreements were reached. Chairman Torvis opened the proceedings with a formal statement. He acknowledged that the galactic situation was dire and that the Council valued humanity's potential contributions to resolving the crisis. He proposed that they immediately discuss military deployment schedules so that human forces could be sent to counter the Krathun threat. Daniel thanked the chairman for his statement, and then politely but firmly declined to discuss military matters. The human position was clear. Political equality must be established first with formal treaties and guaranteed rights, before any conversation about military cooperation could begin. Delegate Thren reacted with visible anger. He stated that people were dying while they wasted time on political posturing. The Krathun had taken 3 systems and were preparing to attack more. Every day of delay cost lives. Surely humanity cared about those lives, about the innocent beings suffering under Krathun occupation. Daniel met Thren's eyes across the table and spoke quietly, but firmly. Of course, humanity cared about those lives. That caring was precisely why humans had spent 30 years serving the Council faithfully, protecting systems, patrolling trade routes, and providing medical care to those in need. But that same caring had been taken for granted, dismissed, and exploited. If the Council wanted humanity's help now, they needed to demonstrate that things would be different. The first day of negotiations ended in deadlock. The Council wanted immediate military action. The humans insisted on political agreements first. Neither side was willing to compromise on the order of discussion. That night, news arrived from the frontier. The Krathun had attacked the Vrexian colony W. Orald of Talos 7. The assault had been brutal and swift, overwhelming the minimal defenses in place. Early casualty reports suggested that tens of thousands were dead, with many more missing or injured. The colony's infrastructure was in ruins. Delegate Thren received the news in his quarters aboard Unity Station. Talos 7 was his homeworld. His extended family lived there, relatives he had grown up with and loved. He spent the night trying to contact anyone on the surface, sending message after message into the void, receiving only silence in return. When negotiations resumed the next morning, Thren was not present. Daniel asked about his absence, and Chairman Torvis explained quietly about Talos 7 and Thren's personal connection to the colony. A recess was called, and Daniel made a decision that was not strictly part of the negotiating strategy. He went to Thren's quarters and requested entry. The Vrexian delegate looked terrible. His usual military bearing collapsed into grief and exhaustion. Daniel asked if there was anything humanity could do to help, and Thren initially responded with anger. asking where that offer had been when the attack was happening. Daniel sat down across from Thren and spoke honestly. He explained that he understood loss and grief, that he had lost people too over the years, and that no political disagreement could make another person's pain matter less. He arranged for human trauma counselors to be made available to the entire council delegation, specialists who dealt with grief and disaster. The gesture was unexpected, and it changed something in the atmosphere of the negotiations. When talks resumed later that day, Thren was present and his attitude had shifted. He began his statement with an acknowledgement that humanity had warned the council about the Krathun threat repeatedly over the years, presenting detailed intelligence and strategic assessments. Those warnings had been dismissed or ignored, classified as human paranoia or overreaction. Thren admitted that the council had been wrong about the Krathun threat, wrong about humanity's value, wrong about how they had treated human contributions and concerns. He looked directly at Daniel as he spoke, and there was no diplomatic distance in his words, only raw honesty born from grief and recognition. Other delegates began to speak, adding their own acknowledgments. The Centauri representative admitted that the economic policies had been unfairly targeted at humanity. The Moran delegate spoke tearfully about how they had depended on human protection without ever properly expressing gratitude. One by one, the council delegates confronted the reality that their institution had systematically undervalued humanity's contributions while taking advantage of human willingness to serve. The breakthrough came on the third day of negotiations. Chairman Torvis proposed a new framework that would give humanity full voting rights on all council matters, equal representation on every committee, and fair trade status with no discriminatory taxes. In return, humanity would agree to assist with the current crisis, deploying military forces to counter the Krathun and restore order to council space. Daniel reviewed the proposal with his team during a recess. Sophie pointed out several clauses that needed strengthening, and Linda identified areas where the language was too vague. They drafted amendments and counter-proposals, working through the details with meticulous care. The final treaty took 2 more days to complete. It was comprehensive and detailed, addressing every aspect of humanity's relationship with the Galactic Council. Equal voting rights were guaranteed with specific mechanisms to prevent marginalization. Trade terms were set at fair rates with regular reviews. Military cooperation was outlined with clear command structures and respect for human tactical doctrine. Cultural exchange programs were established to promote understanding between species. The Treaty of Unity was signed on the 7th day of negotiations. Daniel Green and Chairman Torvis affixed their marks to the document first, followed by all the other delegates. The neutral observers verified that all procedures had been followed correctly and the treaty was legally binding under galactic law. President Carter received word of the successful negotiations and immediately began issuing orders. Human fleets that had been on standby received their deployment instructions. Medical teams prepared to return to frontier stations. Engineers made ready to resume infrastructure projects. The return would be organized and systematic, just like the withdrawal had been. Captain Jake Morrison and the crew of the Defiant were among the first ships to receive orders. They would return to the Moran system, resuming their protective duties but now under the authority of a treaty that recognized their value. Jake gathered his crew and explained the situation. They were going back, but as equals this time. The Defiant jumped into the Moran system 3 days later. The blue-green world appeared on the view screen, familiar and somehow more beautiful than Jake remembered. Messages flooded in from the surface, expressions of joy and relief and gratitude. The Moran government sent an official welcome that included formal thanks for humanity's return. Lieutenant Amy Chen smiled as she read the messages, pleased that they were doing the right thing. Jake authorized a response thanking the Moran for their patience and promising that human forces would remain as long as needed, but this time with proper support from the entire council. In the weeks that followed, human presence gradually returned to council space. Ships took up patrol routes, making them safe again for commerce. Doctors arrived at medical stations, bringing expertise and supplies. Engineers resumed construction projects, working alongside alien colleagues who now treated them with genuine respect. The war against the Krathun continued, but with human tactical expertise and council resources combined, the momentum shifted. The three conquered systems were liberated in coordinated operations that showcased what real cooperation could achieve. The Krathun Empire, faced with unified opposition, sued for peace and withdrew to their original borders. Ambassador Daniel Green addressed the reconvened Galactic Council 6 months after the Treaty of Unity was signed. He spoke about partnership and mutual respect, about the importance of recognizing every member's contributions and treating all species as equals. The chamber listened in silence, and when he finished, the applause was genuine and sustained. President Helen Carter stood in the Oval Office that night, reading reports of human ships working alongside Council forces across the galaxy. Her Chief of Staff, Director Paul Stevens, asked if she believed the Council had truly learned its lesson. Helen looked out at the stars visible through the window and considered the question carefully. Time would tell, she replied. Change didn't happen overnight, and old habits were difficult to break. But the Treaty of Unity gave humanity a foundation to build on, a framework that guaranteed their rights and recognized their worth. And sometimes, she added, you had to walk away from the table to remind everyone why you were invited in the first place.